Hi, Peggy Anazelli. I live in Woodside section of Sayreville for almost 30 years. I'm here today with Doreen Laskowitz, a native of Sayreville. Doreen, I want to thank you very much for taking the moment to share with us your personal information and history about Sayreville.
Oh, I'm excited to share with you. So proud Sayreville, native. Once a bomber, always a bomber. Class of '88.
Nice, go Bombers!
Yay!
So, Doreen, you know what I want to ask you? Tell me about the area of Sayreville that your family is from.
All right, so I am my family, meaning my grandparents, and then the same street where my father ended up buying a house. We grew up in Tangletown, right by Wilson School, proudly so. My family came to Sayreville before the turn of the century, and not the century we had, the one before it. So I do have a couple things to share with some of that family history. Maybe some of you have done, some friends out there have done Ancestry.com, which I absolutely love, and even to show some streets. So I'm going to share a couple pictures. All right, here comes this one. So this is actually from Ancestry.com. It is the 1900 census, and it shows the names Han and Matilda. So those are my great-grandparents on my father's side. And they came from Norway, which you can see all the way to the right of the screen. And it lists their children, Harry, and this interesting name here, it almost looked like Dobbies, and that's what Ancestry originally told me it was, and I couldn't figure it out. And then I think that might have been the Norwegian version of Douglas. So that became Douglas. Actually, Douglas Olson, not my father, who would have been his uncle, passed away in the 1920s, sometime in the 1920s during the pandemic, and that's who my father is actually named after. Wow. So that's really interesting. So I love Ancestry.com. And then actually a couple other, moving forward to the 1920 census. Let me close up. What I love about the 1920 census is they actually start to tell you what streets people lived on.
So what was the first street that you have in Sayreville that your family lived on, and when?
I have, in the 1920 census, I have Matilda, now without Hans, who passed away by the time the 1920 census came around, living on Hillside Avenue, 1920. So it lists my great-grandmother Matilda and my grandfather Harry, and his my Aunt Mabel is now there, but their brother, who would have been Douglas, is not listed. So in the 1920 census. So I don't know if by then he had moved out or he had passed away, but I couldn't find any record of him from the census before that. In terms of my grandmother, my father's mother, Margaret, she was living on Maple Street in 1920. And her maiden name was Keegan. So I know there's probably a bunch of Keegans still living in Sayreville today. But yeah, I have Keegans. And then I'm not quite sure when, but sometime after, having my father in 1935, they moved to Dane Street, 53 Dane Street. And then my parents ended up buying the house across the street, 52 Dane Street, which Peggy, you got to sell for me. So thank you for that, and taking such good care of us. So I am a, Tangletown girl through and through, for sure.
You sure are. And that's how Dory and I met. She had called me with reference to selling her dad's home. But since we're on the subject about your dad and your family, I know how proud you are about your family's connection with the police department. So just share us a little bit of information about how that all started with your family in Sayreville.
So my grandfather started in 1918. So I have a couple little pictures of him from those days and really looking back. And an interesting connection with my family. The first police officers that we had, my grandfather being one of them. Another one, his name was Chris Keegan. Chris Keegan had a brother, Daniel Keegan. Daniel Keegan gave birth to, well, his wife gave birth to my grandmother, was the father of my grandmother, Margaret. So Harry married the niece of somebody he worked with on the police department. So that's just a little interesting tidbit on that. So here's a couple old photos. These I'm not exactly sure when if you could see them, just let me know. I'm not exactly sure of the exact timeline of these. I have a lot of stuff like this. My grandparents, according to one of my aunts, didn't really take a lot of like family pictures. So anything that came from the police department or anybody took a picture of my grandfather in uniform, my grandmother saved. But looking at the actual trim around it, that could be like late 20s, 30s, because that was kind of trendy to have that, that trim around the pictures. I'm not sure if this is in my grandparents' house. There's a door in the back, and they had a back door, which obviously looked a little different as when I was growing up. So my favorite picture of my grandfather is this one, which I'm going to share. I love this picture. I actually have this framed in my house. And I'm not sure. This is a little bit, kind of looks a little more, just seeing how older he is, a little more in the 40s maybe. And he
found out who he's with there. I know you were searching for a while to see who Dad was with there. Did you ever find out?
No, I don't know. Maybe somebody else out there in Sayreville or may know. But I just love the fact that he's out at some function having a beer. And
I wonder if they're over at Burke's Park or Bailey's Park or something at some type of event.
Right, because there's all kinds of buckets and larger buckets that you can see behind them. So that's my favorite one. I have a lot. So my grandfather joined, and I have an interesting article, and I'm going to read a little bit after I share it. My grandmother kept everything that had to do with the police department or pictures like that. So this article, which actually you can't really see very well, and because of the scan, whoops, that's a little too much. But it's really interesting. So I'm going to read just a little bit of this one paragraph because it's actually really relevant to what's happening right now. So this is quoting him in this newspaper article. The article came out in probably in the 1950s because they actually celebrated with testimonial dinners back then. So this might have been an anniversary, 40 years on the force kind of thing, which you don't see that anymore.
No.
But listen to this paragraph and how he talked about some of his time on the force, which is really interesting. In my first year on the force, we had the worst disaster ever, the flu epidemic and the Morgan explosion just before the end of World War I. We worked 24 hours a day during the flu epidemic, helping to take people to the emergency hospital that was set up near the causeway in South River and notifying relatives of the sick and the dead. People just dropped off like flies during the epidemic. So very, very interesting to read, about that with everything going on. But back then they did do testimonial dinners, and I actually have the originals, of course, the original brochures. I actually scanned the back of them. There's two. They actually celebrated him when he was 35 years on the force and then 40 years. So they're only 5 years apart. But the back of them is interesting because you can see the names of the police department during those years.
Oh my goodness. Oh, thank you for sharing.
Right. So it has these like great little bios here.
Look at the names. And bring it back up again. Buchanan. Look at the names. That's Chevalier, Lasco, Osage, Minnick, Sweeney, Sprague, Kilcommons, Guilfoyle. Oh my goodness, thank you so much for sharing this. So many people are going to love this.
And you know, these are only a few years apart. This one on this side, on the right, is from 53. The one on the left is from 58. So you can see how quickly, just in those few years, they increased the police department. So, you know, and I have a lot, like I said, a lot of stuff like that. And then shortly after my parents and my Uncle Weppy were married and established their own families, they too also joined the force. So here's one that some of your older Sayreville friends might remember. This is a photo of donkey baseball. And of course, this is something that we obviously wouldn't be having going on today. So that's my dad sitting on a donkey. It looks like it was the fields behind the Barrel Hall. And they had games where they couldn't run the bases. They had to ride a donkey there.
Oh, so. I do believe that's Dolan Street. If I go over there, I'm going to take a picture of that background today where the football field is for the Pee-wees now, and Panthers and Morgan Panthers got together. So I'm going to take that picture. I can't thank you enough for everything that you have shared with us. I hope everybody watching this gives us a lot of their feedback. And Doreen, if anybody wants to get in touch with you for some of the names that are on there, how can they contact you?
I'm on Facebook. You can contact me actually if you want through my business page, facebook.com/Doreen L Photography. I do a lot of scanning and I also restore pictures. So, but for those Sayreville friends out there who are looking for pictures of relatives that might have been involved in the police department, there's a good chance that I might have something of them. I have pictures of swearing-ins from the 40s and 50s and all kinds of, you know, historical stuff. But if you have old pictures and you need restoring, I do that too. So through my Facebook page, Doreen Laskowitz Photography is a great way to reach out. And if there's anything I have, I'd love to scan it for you and send it to you.
Thank you so much. And again, Realtor Peggy, Century 21 Charles Smith Agency, 732-721-9000. If you need to get in touch with Doreen, you can inbox me also. Doreen, thank you so much for your time.